In the year 793, on the windswept northeastern coast of England, life moved with a rhythm that had remained unchanged for generations. Far from royal courts, political rivalries, and the violence of continental wars, the island monastery of Lindisfarne existed in a world built on prayer, silence, and routine. Monks copied manuscripts by candlelight. Bells marked the passing of each hour. Food was grown, prepared, and shared within stone walls that seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. To those who lived there, the monastery was more than a place. It was protection. It was certainty. And for the women who served nearby, nuns attached to smaller religious communities across the Northumbrian coast, it represented something even deeper. Safety. The communities were not wealthy in the way kings measured wealth. There were no armies, no fortifications, no trained guards, but there were relics, manuscripts, silver crosses, carved altars, and generations of accumulated devotion. And in the 8th century, that was enough to make them visible. Weeks before the attack, fishermen reported strange sails on the horizon, dark shapes, low in the water, moving faster than local vessels. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration. Others blamed weather, fear, or rumor. England had seen raiders before, small groups, opportunists, isolated attacks. Nothing suggested what was coming. Then one morning, the bells stopped, not because prayer had ended, but because the men ringing them were no longer standing. From the shoreline, witnesses described long narrow ships cutting through the mist like shadows. Their prows were unfamiliar. Their movement was precise. Their arrival carried no negotiation, no warning, no demand. Only speed. The first people to see them clearly were not soldiers. They were servants. Women carrying water. Children gathering wood. And by the time the alarm spread through the monastery grounds, it was already too late. The raiders moved with purpose, not hesitation, not confusion. Purpose. They knew where sacred objects were kept. They knew which buildings held silver, and they understood something their victims did not. Faith does not stop steel. That morning, the people of Lindisfarne did not yet know the name of the men stepping onto their shore, but history would remember them as Vikings, and this was only the beginning. At first, many inside Lindisfarne did not understand what they were seeing. The ships were unfamiliar. The men stepping onto the shore looked unlike anything most of them had ever encountered. Tall figures covered in animal furs, layered leather, iron, and salt-stained wool. Their movements were fast, coordinated, and silent in a way that made them seem almost unreal. For the monks, the first instinct was not to fight. It was to protect what was sacred. Relics were gathered. Manuscripts were hidden. Doors were barred. Prayers were whispered. But prayer does not change momentum. And momentum was exactly what the raiders had. The Vikings did not waste time testing the walls. They studied them. They observed movement. They followed those who ran. And in minutes, they identified what mattered most. Entrances, storage rooms, treasuries. The buildings themselves had never been designed for war. Stone walls protected against weather, not axes. Wooden doors created privacy, not resistance. And the people inside had no military structure, no chain of command, no defensive training. What followed was not a battle. It was penetration. One entrance fell, then another, and once the first group entered the inner grounds, panic replaced routine. Some monks attempted to hide sacred objects. Others attempted to flee. Some simply froze. Because when violence enters a place built entirely on order, the mind often struggles to process what is happening. But the monks were not the only ones there. Within the surrounding communities, women who had spent their lives serving religious houses, copying texts, preparing food, caring for the sick, preserving traditions, were now facing something no scripture had prepared them for. The Vikings were not there only for gold. They were there for value. And in the medieval world, value came in many forms. Some women tried to escape through rear paths leading toward the coast. Others locked themselves inside storage buildings, praying the noise would pass. Some never made it that far, because the raiders moved faster than fear, and fear moves quickly, but steel moves faster. Witness accounts written years later describe screams carried by the wind, doors torn from hinges, crosses ripped from stone altars, sacred cloth soaked in mud and blood. But many of those accounts stop there. They describe the raid, not what came after, because what happened after was harder to write, and even harder to preserve. Most historical records of the Viking raids focus on what was visible: the burning buildings, the stolen silver, the shattered altars, the dead. These details were easier to document, easier to quantify, easier for chroniclers to record within the language of war. But not everyone affected by the raid died that day, and not everyone was left behind. Some were taken, and among those taken were women. The religious communities surrounding northern England were not always isolated in a single building. Smaller convents, attached service houses, and protected religious compounds existed throughout the region. Women living in these communities were not warriors. They were not political figures. They held no military value, at least not in the way kingdoms measured power. But to the Vikings, power was not always political. Sometimes it was practical, and sometimes it was personal. The captives were separated quickly. Those considered too weak to move were abandoned. Those who could walk were forced toward the shoreline, hands bound, valuables removed, voices ignored. For many, the first sight of the longships from the inside would also be the last sight of their homeland. The journey itself was brutal, not because of combat, but because of conditions: cold, salt, crowded decks, limited food, no certainty, no explanation, no destination explained, and perhaps most terrifying of all, no language they could understand. What happened once those ships disappeared beyond the English coast remains difficult to reconstruct completely. Some records suggest captives were sold. Others indicate integration into households, forced labor, or movement through expanding trade networks that stretched across Scandinavia, Ireland, and even Eastern territories. The details vary, but the pattern remains. They did not simply disappear. They were absorbed into a world that did not ask who they had been before, and in many cases, history stopped recording them entirely, because conquerors often record victories, but they rarely record what happens to the people who survive them. By the time the ships disappeared beyond the English coast, the lives of the captives had already changed in ways that could not be reversed. For the women taken during the raids, the journey north was not just physical. It was cultural, religious, psychological. Everything familiar was gone. The prayers they had memorized since childhood, the bells that once marked the passing of time, the language that had shaped every thought, the routines that had given meaning to ordinary days. All of it remained behind on a coastline they would likely never see again. For many captives, the first land they saw after leaving England was not a battlefield. It was a settlement, a Viking settlement. Not the chaotic image later myths would create, but something more unsettling. Order, wooden halls, families, children running between homes, animals being fed, food being prepared, life continuing. This was not a world built entirely on violence. It was a world that included violence as part of normal life, and for the captives, that made adaptation even harder, because monsters are easier to understand. Systems are not. Some women were placed into households. Some were moved through trade networks stretching across Scandinavia, Ireland, and the expanding routes that connected the north to Eastern Europe. Some likely became laborers. Some were integrated into local communities. Some disappeared into systems where their original names, languages, and identities slowly stopped being used, not because they chose to forget, but because survival often demands replacement, and replacement, over time, becomes transformation. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements suggests cultural blending in ways older chroniclers never fully documented. Religious objects buried far from their place of origin, foreign fabrics, Christian symbols found beside Norse artifacts, names appearing in records that do not fit local patterns, fragments, hints, evidence that some of those taken did not simply die. They lived. But living and returning are not the same thing, because by the time years passed, by the time languages changed, by the time children were born, the people who had once stood inside English convents no longer existed in the way history first knew them. They had become something else. And perhaps the hardest truth of all was that many survived long enough to be forgotten. When the news of the raid spread across England, the shock was immediate. Religious communities that had existed for generations suddenly felt exposed. Monasteries once believed to be protected by distance, devotion, and tradition now understood something terrifying. They were visible, and more importantly, they were vulnerable. The attack on Lindisfarne was not simply remembered because of what was stolen. It was remembered because of what it changed. Across England, bells still rang. Prayers still continued. Scriptures were still copied. But something fundamental had shifted. Faith remained. Certainty did not. Coastal communities changed how they lived. Watch posts appeared where none had existed before. Monasteries began relocating valuables. Routes changed. Warnings traveled faster. Rumors became planning. And with every new sail seen on the horizon, fear returned. But while monks wrote about burned churches and stolen relics, the women taken during those first raids slowly disappeared from the written record, not because they were unimportant, but because medieval history often preserved institutions before individuals, wars before survivors, kings before captives, and systems before human cost. This is why their stories are harder to reconstruct, not because they never existed, but because the people who recorded history often stopped looking once the ships left the shore. What remains today is not a complete record. It is fragments, archaeological evidence, foreign names, burial patterns, religious symbols found where they should not be, and those fragments suggest something difficult to ignore. The victims of the first Viking raids were not only those who died. Some of the greatest losses were the people who lived, who adapted, who disappeared into other worlds, and whose names history never brought home.